Once I'd uploaded my video on Fjorden, I thought it'd be interesting to do a real-world comparison of an iPhone versus a professional-grade camera. As I'm primarily a landscape photographer, landscapes will be the focus of this video. Now, to be clear, this is not a fair comparison. It puts an iPhone 12 against a Sony A7R IV with a top-of-the-line G Master 16-35 2.8. But the ultimate goal here isn't just to compare the quality of these cameras. I want to discuss the controls of each and how it is to use them in a real-world landscape photo shoot. I often incorporate motion into my shoots through long exposure photography techniques. It didn't take much thought for me to determine that I wanted this comparison to involve long exposure photography. The question that I mulled over for a couple of days was whether I should attempt to shoot water, clouds, or both. Ultimately, I decided on water. I chose the lighthouse in Holland, Michigan to be the subject of this shoot. I brought 2 tripods, one equipped with a smartphone holder. I chose to shoot at sunrise because I knew there'd be less foot traffic at the time, and 2 tripods ended up taking an entire sidewalk. I set the tripods and cameras up in as similar a manner as possible. I wanted to get similar compositions with the most similar shots possible. I downloaded 3 separate camera apps to use on the iPhone: Obscura, Halide, and Pro Camera. Pro Camera ended up being unusable for this test as it reliably crashed after being mounted to the smartphone holder. Since this test was time limited by the sunrise, I didn't have time to troubleshoot this in the field, which meant that the comparison would be limited to using Halide and Obscura. I knew I could use these non-standard camera apps to slow the iPhone's shutter speed, but I was surprised that they limited me to a 1-second shot. I just couldn't go any slower than that. I started shooting the lighthouse from the public park, which meant shooting at a less than ideal southwest angle. As the sun rises in the east, shooting towards the east would have been preferable for me. Unfortunately, in this case, private property makes getting to the east side much more challenging. I was disappointed to see the lack of cloud cover towards the southwest this morning, but I knew that wouldn't prevent me from completing this test. Luckily, a large number of fishing boats started moving through the channel out towards Lake Michigan. When I saw this, I decided to take long exposure shots of the boat's lights as they passed by the lighthouse. Unfortunately, the iPhone's dismal shutter speed options made it impossible for me to accomplish this task. I was able to hold the Sony shutter open with ease, allowing me to take a shot like this. I'd like you to recall that I mentioned earlier that this test shoot wasn't just to compare these cameras' image qualities. Rather, a goal I had here was to compare ease of use due to their respective controls. The first problem I encountered with the iPhone's touch-only controls was the fact that the smartphone mount I used restricted about 1/4 of the screen while it was mounted to the tripod. This meant that I had to attempt to choose the least useful portion of the screen to mount it on, while hopefully not restricting my ability to see the touchscreen controls. I was able to accomplish this, but it did make composing a shot more challenging than it needed to be. In comparison, the Sony A7R IV was a dream to use. As you'd expect, its tripod mount didn't obscure the camera at all. In addition, the external controls made adjusting settings a breeze. I didn't have to attempt to negotiate a touchscreen that was partially blocked by a tripod mount. I had to turn a couple dials and press a couple buttons to change my exposure, which resulted in faster and more intuitive exposure adjustments. Another problem I ran into with the iPhone was that it had shut off once a certain interval of time had passed. This meant that I'd need to dismount the phone in order to enter my passcode and then remount it to recompose and shoot. Now, this isn't something that I'm positive Fjorden can improve upon. I don't know if it's able to wake up the iPhone or if it's required to use the touchscreen to do that. But I am fairly confident that Fjorden's external controls would make the iPhone much easier to use once it has been mounted. I suspect that the ideal mount location would be off to the left of the Fjorden device to allow a photographer to have unrestricted access to its controls. I could see how some mounts might make the controls harder to access if the phone is mounted more rightward, which seems to be where the Fjorden should be mounted on the back of the phone. I think it's also worth noting here that slowing the iPhone's shutter causes its display to become choppy. It's clear that Apple didn't intend for this device to be shot at slower speeds than intended. Compared to the A7R IV, this was a nuisance since it caused a delay when composing shots with a slower shutter speed. Since it might not be ideal to limit a comparison just to controls, I did put together some materials to demonstrate these cameras' respective image qualities. The iPhone 12's camera is 12 megapixels and the A7R IV's is 60. This means that the images that come out of the Sony are much larger than those from the iPhone. This side-by-side comparison shows the iPhone's smaller image size compared to the A7R IV's larger size. Here's a side-by-side detail comparison from the two cameras. While it appears that the iPhone does have a capable camera in comparison to the Sony, inspection showed it to be considerably noisier. Additionally, it was obvious to me while editing these images that the Sony had much more dynamic range and far better color science than the iPhone. To demonstrate this, compare these zoomed-in images of this lighthouse. First from the iPhone, and now from the Sony. When you compare these full images side by side, you can see that the Sony has a couple distinct advantages. First, its variable zoom allowed me to avoid the railing that the iPhone couldn't. Additionally, its ability to keep its shutter open longer allowed me to take an exposure where the water appeared much smoother, which I think is preferable to the water as it appears in the iPhone shot. I came to a couple distinct conclusions from this video. First and foremost, I think it's necessary to compare the two cameras in a setting that doesn't require a tripod. I think it might be more reasonable to compare how the two are at street photography, as that would allow unrestricted use of the controls to each camera at all times. I think it would be a far better scenario to demonstrate how external controls could aid iPhone photographers. Second, I think this video could have been planned better. That isn't to say the location was bad, far from it, but I set out to compare the controls and ended up with a result that compares the controls and the image quality without going into adequate detail on either element. That said, it's a lesson that I intend to use to continue improving the quality of videos on this channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next week.